Welcome, boys and girls. Costin here with a discussion about Nagash and the vampire counts in Total War Warhammer Free Immortal Empires. Creative Assembly has not really given us any information about Nagash ever since they announced Lords of the End Times, which is a bit weird. I mean, they've talked about Boris, they've talked about Glotkin. Hopefully Nagash will be next, though maybe they're saving him up for last in terms of marketing. It is a question where he's going to start. Some people would obviously speculate that he would start in Nagash SR, which, if that's going to be the case, I certainly hope they're going to change the way that this province works, because right now it is kind of a pain to navigate through. I mean, the distances you got to cover between settlements as well as the mountain situation makes it annoying to navigate. Like if you're playing Emmerich and you want to take Nagash SR, it's something you realize very, very quickly. The mod that has Nagash gives you portals to Khemri, but I'm not sure if that would be in order, because if you look at Nagash in the End Times, what he did is he kind of started in Drakenhof. I believe that's where he was brought back. Then he moved all the way to Khemri, invaded Khemri, took over the god of the underworld, tricked Cetra. Yes, Cetra did lose in the End Times, and then took over the Tomb Kings. And before that, he had also gotten the support of Luthor Harkon and the Vampire Coast, because when you look at the Vampire Coast in the lore, really, it's just basically Luthor Harkon. The other characters are either Dreadfleet characters, which are not relevant in the overall lore, or they're Silustra, who was invented for Warhammer 2. It does bring the question up of whether or not Nagash will allow you to start your campaign as him and at what kind of level, and whether or not you would get one of those generals that he does have. So you're looking at Neferata, you're looking at Arkhan. The initial trailer did show Arkhan and Manfred on his side, which makes sense because they were the ones that brought him back. Though there's also relevant questions to ask with regards to Kemmler, who kind of initially fought alongside Arkhan, then decided, okay, I'm going to join Chaos, but then Krell didn't stick around with that and instead joined Nagash. So there's a lot of questions with regards to Krell and with regards to how they're going to handle the various legendary lords that were part of Nagash's forces in the End Times. I mean, are they going to stay as part of their race, or are you going to join Nagash, for instance, if you're playing them? Like, you know, if you're playing Kemmler, maybe you do have that choice of joining Nagash or joining Chaos in your campaign with pros and cons. Those are the kind of discussions, and I guess that's one of the reasons why Creative Assembly has not really revealed much information on Nagash, because they might just be looking to see how they're going to handle that aspect. Though, given the fact that we're, 1 month and a half away from release, assuming it does come out at the very end of summer, at the very end of August, then I suppose at this point they've kind of pretty much decided how they're going to handle that aspect. With Neferata, it is very likely that she's going to start in the Silver Pinnacle, so what you're probably going to want to do as Neferata is try and take Zarnagrund very, very quickly in your campaign. I would say with the Vampire Counts Legendary Lords, there's the discussion about mechanics and how those mechanics are going to work out during the course of a campaign. So none of the legendary lords, with the exception of Manfred, who only has the Books of Nagash as a mechanic, none of them have unique mechanics in their campaigns, and maybe they should. Like, you know, maybe Gorst, no one really cares too much about him, but when you look at Kemmler, when you look at Vlad, when you look at Isabella, and even Manfred, that is certainly a discussion, I think, that you can rework the race, but I also think Creative Assembly does need to give the existing legendary lords unique mechanics. And then there's also the discussion about Vlad and Isabella, because they were separated in End Times. I guess Isabella was brought back by Nurgle, of all people, who turned her against Vlad. Vlad fought for Nagash, but one of his main motivating factors was his desire to get Isabella back. He was also quite eager to help out the Empire in the end times, though that kind of didn't work out for a variety of reasons, but he was really the only character in the entire undead factions, or of any of the undead factions, that was really trying to stop Archeon and the end of the world. Nagash, not so much. Like, Nagash's goals were initially to, like, okay, I'm going to do this ritual, I'm going to become a god, I'm going to take over chaos. And that's the reason Nurgle and Ekeclaw actually, and various other forces, threw everything they had against Nagash to stop him. Because if he had succeeded, he might have actually won the end times. Except that the nuclear-powered rat was able to prevent that. Yes, nuclear weapons destroyed the Black Pyramid of Nagash, and as a result of that, Nagash did lose, I believe, a good portion of his power, because, yeah, a good portion of it is tied to the Black Pyramid itself, or is from the Black Pyramid itself. Though I'm not entirely certain about that, but regardless, there were a bunch of rituals. In fact, one of the last people to try and stop the return of Nagash in the end times was Elfarion. Like, there was a battle where Tyrion's daughter was captured, then Tyrion and Thorgrim tried to get her back, they failed, and then Elfarion threw everything he had to try and rescue her, and he failed. Then you have the discussion about the Fey Enchantress as well, and Volkmar. So you do have the question of, like, what's going to happen with these different characters in the lore and in the game, right? Like, are they just going to be removed from the campaign map, or are we going to ignore that, or is the Nagash campaign just going to be about doing that ritual, or a good portion of it is going to be devoted to that ritual? I'm of the mind that it would be better if the campaign started with Nagash at full power. Like, that's my perspective on the subject. Or full power before he destroyed, defeat, etc. And so that would be a good starting point. Like, he's brought back, and you have to go invade Khemri, take over that, and then try and deal with everyone uniting against you, more or less, or Chaos trying to invade you. And maybe even the Order tie, depending on how things work. Now, for the vampire counts themselves as a race, there's several critical issues that I think Creative Assembly needs to solve. One of these is actually related to battles, and specifically with sieges, but it also applies in field battles. So the vampire counts have a fairly solid enough army, but the problem is, it being an undead-only army, you do have this issue of losing units if their leadership is damaged. Now, this is, of course, an issue for the Tomb Kings as well, but the Tomb Kings make do because they have a lot of different range units, artillery, constructs. The vampire counts don't have the same level, don't have the same power at constructs. They certainly don't have anything that could compare to Ushabti, especially Ushabti with bows, and they lack range power. The bigger problem that exists here is that while their lords and heroes are very strong, except necromancers, but even so, while their lords and melee lords and heroes are strong and quite capable of winning battles on their own, their army kind of just plays second fiddle. Like, because you lose the entire unit if the leadership is broken, so you obviously want to avoid that kind of situation happening in battles. It is acceptable enough in field battles because you have mobility, you have fast movers, you have flying units. Don't underestimate the Felbats, or certainly not the Vargeists. But in sieges, you don't have the ability of breaking down walls. You don't have anything to help you win siege battles without taking significant casualties. So one of the things that happens in a lot of Vampire Counts campaigns that I've played is that you kind of realize that you're just best off having your army AFK while your lords and heroes and maybe a couple of good units win the battle. And that's one of those things that I believe Creative Assembly should look to change. Again, a lot of it has to do with the lack of range power, but having units with Wall Breaker would go a very, very long way towards solving that. Like, for instance, why doesn't the Vargulf have Wall Breaker? That's pretty reasonable question, I think, from a campaign standpoint. And, we could also talk about the ghosts having to climb up ladders, but especially relevant to talk about this because Creative Assembly is talking about, like, changing Siege Attacker and various other things in Sieges, but the Vampire Counts right now have a gameplay dynamic with regards to Sieges that is not especially fun to engage in. They're a good race from a campaign perspective. They have the power from a campaign perspective, but it's just that battle gameplay that leaves quite a bit to be desired. To be clear, you definitely can win, and even so against most factions without too many problems, either because you can use vassalizations, or you can get more armies, or you can raise dead to get endgame units, but you do kind of end up in that problem spot where you realize, yeah, this is the best way to play, use Lords and Heroes, and just your army is there to look prey for the most part, or only use it in an emergency situation, and not an ideal gameplay loop from my perspective. Other things that I would say should be changed then if we look at the structures, I think hero recruitment tiers should be reduced, or hero capacity tiers should be reduced. Yes, you can get as many necromancers as you want, but it would be fun if you're playing a Vampire Counts campaign that isn't Vlad or Isabella, where you could actually get vampires when it's relevant in a campaign. Same with getting more Banshees in a campaign, same with getting White King. So this is my perspective, generally speaking, with regards to hero capacity, that it should be increased at tier 3 across the board in the game. I know people will argue, well, what about the end game? Well, I think the end game is going to be determined, the quality of an end game scenario from, fun perspective is going to be determined on whether or not the end game itself is good. But not having that hero variety actually really hurts the early game, regardless of how good the end game is. Spoiler alert, the end game right now is not really good, or pretty much non-existent. Obviously, that's something they're looking to change in end times, but all the same, I do have a big question mark with regards to that. Also, it'd be nice to have like an intermediate economic structure right here, just to have something to build at tier 3 with, regards to the economy building. I mean, the economy works, don't get me wrong, but yeah, just some building changes across the board would be great. Then we have, obviously, the research tree. As it currently stands, there are some very useful things in the research tree, but it's just very outdated, very old, and could use an overhaul. Like, as it currently stands, one of the biggest benefits is to get infiltrate noble houses, to get that diplomatic relations from everyone. Then, maybe get something like growth, plus 15. And then you could also talk about, like, if you're playing Gorse, buffing up the zombies. But there's not really a whole lot of choice, and certainly a lot of these things just kind of feel like fluff, really, or filler. I also think the entire mechanic of the Dead Rise Again doesn't quite work out as well as Creative Assembly wanted it to in a campaign. Because, and it's the same situation for Demons. Because the idea of losing units and then having a chance for them to come back is not exactly how you want to play your battles, really. You want to avoid this scenario as much as possible in a campaign, and you can. So, yeah, something like one of these mechanics that I think should be changed. They have talked about the idea that they're going to bring in a new climate type, like Undead Wasteland, so I'm guessing Sylvania is going to be part of that. It kind of never made sense for me, like how easy it was and how valuable taking Sylvania would be for the Empire. But then the real problem with that is, like, can you nullify climate penalties? And I think that's generally a question that Creative Assembly should ask themselves, like, can we just implement a baseline mechanic where races can nullify climate penalties, and, if after 10 turns or something like that of taking over the territory, maybe speeding it up with research or certain structures, maybe dependent on the level of corruption. Like, it makes sense. I mean, if chaos invades the world, for instance, they're obviously going to transform stuff into chaotic wasteland. So climate adaptability, as it's been called, but not really adaptability, more like climate change, changing the climate of a particular region. And I'm a bit iffy on that whole thing, because if they're going to change, they're going to touch on the way they handle climate, then the big question is, are they going to hurt vampire counts when it comes to climate situation? Because obviously, if you're invading territory that isn't suitable, that doesn't have vampire corruption, you're going to take attrition. This, in fact, was one of the bigger problems that vampire counts used to have. Nowadays, it's not really relevant because of the distances between settlements, as well as the fact that you gain a lot of corruption. But they've talked about before about changing the way corruption works, and I'm just quite skeptical about that in general. Then we have the discussion about Bloodlines. So I like the idea of the Bloodline system as a concept. I like the lords you gain. So, for instance, blood dragons are freaking awesome, especially. Others, not necessarily so much. But beyond improvements in terms of skill lines for lords and heroes, etc., like, that's one of the things that, Creative Assembly should do. It's like, add more skills or unique skills, overhaul the skill lines for lords, heroes, maybe even legendary lords. We could talk about that. But the issue with Bloodlines is, well, twofold. One, or threefold. One, some choices in terms of lords are just better than others. Like, for instance, a blood dragon is generally going to be the best choice from a military commander standpoint, not just because he's very strong from a combat perspective, but also because the benefits you gain from a military perspective, like 100 experience per turn, is very significant, as well as, Blood Knight units, and then a skill line that reduces the upkeep of both Blood Knights and Graveguard for an army. That's one of the reasons it allows you to maintain more armies across the board, which is something the other lord choices don't have. Sure, Costin gives you a couple of Sylvanian crossbowmen and hunt gunners, though that's not enough to make up for the deficiencies you have. I mean, really, if you want range units, you can use allied recruitment and vassalization. We could talk about how the vassalization system is kind of broken, because, like, for instance, if you're playing Vlad and Isabella, just rush for Grand Peak, take it before Ungrim, build a barracks there, and you can vassalize Ungrim, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about the relationship between dwarves and vampires. Like, the dwarves want to exterminate them. But then, beyond the fact that some are better than others from a combat perspective or a campaign perspective, you also have to consider the fact some of the benefits are just flat out better than others. Like, getting casualty replenishment, the only benefit with Von Karstein's is, like, getting those Sylvanian crossbowmen and handgunners in its very limited amounts, and you only have so many limited lords, so you're not really going to run around range armies. The casualty replenishment control are kind of fluff, for instance. You can benefit your Strigoi, but yeah, as useful as Cryptors can be in certain respects, you compare that to the vast amount of experience that you can get with Blood Dragons, or the significant amount of character experience that you do gain with Lamians, as well as diplomatic relations with the Empire, Keys of Cathay, and Bretonia, which really makes Vampire Count's diplomacy work. Basically, Blood Dragons and Lamians, in terms of the campaign benefits that you get from leveling up their bloodlines, are just much better. And it's always going to be a better decision to save up your blood kisses to get those bloodlines than getting lords from other bloodlines, so just because you can get significant benefits at a high level. Though that brings up the point, the final one, which is that getting blood kisses is annoying. The way you gain blood kisses is you either vassalize their faction, hooray, that's fun, or you assassinate the character, or you eliminate faction leaders in battle, though that's only really for the first time. So, unlike so many other campaigns, when you're playing a Vampire Counts campaign, you want to get assassin heroes. Not because you need them to win campaign battles or to conquer territory, but just literally to get blood kisses. And I think that is not how the system should work. I'm not quite sure how they should overhaul it, but I think the idea of just, oh, I'm going to send assassin heroes across the map just to kill characters for the sake of blood kisses is frankly a frustrating gameplay loop in of itself. That's something I would hope for Creative Assembly to fix with regards to vampire counts. There's plenty more, of course, that they could do, like certain changes to units, of course, and we don't know what kind of units they're going to add with the Lords of the End Times DLC. Probably just Nagash stuff, but hopefully they are going to add some units that you're going to use as the undead factions in general. Not just Nagash, whatever he ends up being, like a hybrid between Tomb Kings, Vampire Counts, maybe something to overhaul the Vampire Coast, though I'm guessing we're not going to get a rework for the Vampire Coast, which is rather unfortunate. Something that would benefit the Vampire Counts and Vampire Coast, and even Tomb Kings to an extent, would be an overhaul to the way auto-resolve works, but I guess we're not going to get that. Or maybe we will. Maybe CA will surprise us on that level. I mean, it certainly would be terrible if you could just auto-resolve against Archeon in the endgame crisis. I'm just pointing it out. Anyway, that's all I had to say on the subject. Costin signing out. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more.